Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm joined today with Joe Schmid. Joe, how's it going?
It's going great. It's great to be on your channel.
Yeah, great to have you. Glad you could come on. Looking forward to it. Joe's done quite a bit of work in philosophy of religion. Been helpful with me so far. He's friends with Josh Rasmussen, so he's already getting up there. You're actually mentioned in the acknowledgments of his one of his books coming out, right?
I do believe so. Yes. I'm really looking forward to that book. It's going to be a tour de force, and
Yeah,
Josh is just such an amazing dude. Wow, he's so great.
yeah, he's great. Yeah, Joe also has a blog, Majesty of Reason, I believe, at
Yeah. Yeah.
WordPress.com.
I'm slightly
Yeah,
inactive,
so
but
that's good. Yeah, so if you want to read more of Joe's content, check that out. Yeah, so that's a little bit of your background. You want to tell us a little bit more? Tell everybody. I mean, I already know, of course. You want to tell anyone who may be viewing a little bit more about yourself, why you're interested in philosophy of religion, and what we'll be discussing today specifically, and all that, and why you're interested in it.
yeah. So the topic of discussion today, as we talked about, was going to be the scientific realism anti-realism debate. What got me interested into that was it's actually going to be incorporated into a chapter of a book that I'm writing, and that's going to hopefully be published within the next few years. I'm in the process of writing it, but it's basically the tentative title is "The Majesty of Reason." A guide to
Ah,
no, that's the title, but the subtitle reason, a guide to critical thinking in philosophy. And so it's gonna be split up into four parts. The first part is basically just going to be dedicated to um, sort of cultivating the dispositional and personality traits of a critical thinker. So it's like basically virtue epistemology. It's going to talk about intellectual humility, intellectual courage, open-mindedness, and skepticism, and sort of the virtues of that. And it's also going to talk about sort of cognitive biases and heuristics that affect us, um, and how we can avoid those. And then, yeah, part two is going to be logic.
ah,
That it's basically gonna because logic is sort of like the structure of critical thinking because arguments are essential to critical thinking, and so the arguments themselves are just built on logic. It's the foundation of arguments, right? Um, and so I thought for any critical thinker, you need a background in logic. So I'm just going to touch on sort of the basics of categorical logic, of Aristotle, propositional logic, and then a small bit of a pinch of um, relational and modal logic, just a pinch of that. Uh,
splash. Yeah.
yeah, and then part three is going to be the sort of meat of it. It's going to be like tools, methods, principles of critical thinking, like how to draw distinctions, how to analyze soundness and validity, how to evaluate arguments. I'm going to talk about all the distinctions that one can make, like analytic synthetic propositions, contingent necessary, de re de ditto necessity, things like that. So it's going to be really fun for that one because that's just how to evaluate, analyze arguments. We're going to talk about fallacies, question begging, all that fun stuff. Um, and then part four is applications, and so I'm going to apply what we've learned in the previous chapters to new and interesting problems in philosophy of religion, philosophy of science. So, for example, we're going to talk about the realism-anti-realism debate. We're going to talk about scientism. We're going to talk about God's existence, things like that, and it'll be specifically focused on a specific issue. So, yeah. So I'm really
Okay,
looking forward to that, and that's why I've been researching realism, anti-realism as of late.
that's pretty cool. One thing I was going to ask you was, I mean, I know a little bit about what inspired you to write that book, but what was it really to you that seemed to be missing from other works in that field? Because I mean, we both, like you, kind of recommended to me the Philosopher's Toolkit by Julian Bergini, which I have, and like an Introduction to Philosophical Analysis by John Hosper is another one I got. So, what is it that's missing from what's been done so far that you kind of want to do? Are you just going to want to do the same thing better? Or you just is that
Oh man, oh that is such a good question because it's precisely because I saw all these like sort of disparate parts of critical thinking that are spread out in different books, but none of them combines them into one book. So, um, for example, a lot of intros to critical thinking, and a lot of like textbooks on critical thinking, even the Philosopher's Toolkit, they don't take into account that sort of dispositional aspect to critical thinking, which is like the sort of necessary precondition for critical thinking in the first place. Without that, you're just going to be sort of trying to confirm your own beliefs through arguments, and like you're going to be tribalistically defending your own theses instead of on a collective search for truth. And so I really wanted to integrate the sort of dispositional aspect with the more so like the critical thinking and philosophy aspect. So that's one thing I really wanted to integrate those two. Another thing is taking it from a very specific philosophical perspective on critical thinking, whereas a lot of other critical thinking books are just like critical thinking in general. Whereas I wanted to do it specifically in analyzing and evaluating philosophical arguments and things like that. So I think that's gonna be really good. Yeah. So it's
Yeah, no,
mainly
I
those
agree.
two reasons, and attention to logic. Like some critical thinking textbooks and even Julian Baggini's, like they're kind of limited in regard to the logic knowledge that they convey, and so I think that that's just so essential to critical thinking. So yeah, those three reasons.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's good. I know I'm looking forward to it.
Hmm.
It'll be it'll be good. Because I mean, it is hard to jump right into philosophy of religion, like Graham Oppie's writing, for example, without a little bit of background in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like you
Definitely.
can't just get right into that. But yeah, so that's really good. So yeah, so today we're going to specifically, unless you had any more plugs on the book, we could jump right into a little bit of what you've been
No,
looking
I'm
at.
just really
Um,
excited for it, and it's not going to be published until like 2022, 2023. So we got a long ways away, because I've only written like something like 55 pages on it, and I'm still in the process of researching. So yeah, but nope, no more plugs.
yeah, so at least not for now. We'll see.
Hmm.
But yeah, so we're going to talk about scientific realism and the realism-anti realism debate specifically, which I don't know all that much about, but you've been researching a lot, so we can kind of see um, what your thoughts. If you wanted to give, I don't know if you wanted to give like an intro. I mean,
Hmm.
I know the basics, but for everybody, you could explain it better. So,
Yeah, yeah.
what's the background?
Yeah, so realism in general, just in philosophy itself, usually takes some domain of inquiry. For example, mathematics, or for example, scientific theories, um, and it takes that domain and it says that those things exist. They exist independently of our thoughts and conceptions and yeah, thoughts about the world. So they exist in mind independently. They're sort of objective. And in addition to that, they say such thing. This is a sort of semantic thesis as well, that such things are construed literally. So our talk of, for example, mathematical entities is literal and not metaphorical. The same thing with unobservable scientific entities postulated by our scientific theories, etc. So that's a sort of realist, the general realist claim on things. So you could be a realist in regard to universals. For example, you can believe that universals exist, they're mind independent, and talk about universals as literal. There's also
Yeah,
yeah, so that's the general realist thesis, and anti-realists just say that they deny one of these. So normally they're going to deny either that unobservables exist, or most often they're going to say that we have to be skeptical or agnostic about the existence of whatever it is in the domain. So the domain in question here is scientific theories, but more especially the unobservable entities postulated within those scientific theories. So we're thinking things like quarks, strings, electrons, black holes, um, maybe electromagnetic radiation, though that's a little tricky, because even light,
white holes.
light is a form of
Yeah,
electromagnetic radiation, but you can see it. So other things like perhaps gamma rays, and so on. So the realist says that our best scientific theories, our mature scientific theories, um, which are successful. These things are true. They're to be interpreted literally, and yeah, they're or at least approximately true. They are approximately true descriptions of reality. Whereas the anti-realists, on the other hand, would just say that no, they're perhaps just empirically adequate, which means that just their whatever they say about the observable world is correct. Whatever all their observable consequences are true, whereas what they say about the unobservable entities um, and some of the causal mechanisms underlying the observable phenomena, we have to be agnostic about those, and they have various reasons for thinking about that. So they are skeptical either of the unobservable entities or even the approximate truth of the theories. They may think that they're just useful or successful but false, and so on. Um, so yeah, that's the general conceptual terrain there.
okay. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So let's see where to build off of that. I mean, what do you we talked a little about this before, like I think what was it? You called it like pessimistic induction or
Yeah, yeah, the
something.
pessimistic
Yeah,
induction.
you wanted to talk about that a little bit in terms of in regards to I mean one objection I think it is scientific realism is the fact that past scientific theories have so often failed. What reason do we have to believe that our current ones are a good guide and map to what we will know in the future? How do we know it's going to be accurate? So, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So it's worth noting that there are definitely arguments that many philosophers find convincing on both sides of the issue. And so on the anti-realist side, there are a few central arguments. One of them is the pessimistic induction or the pessimistic meta-induction. Sometimes you'll find that in the literature. And yeah, like you said, it's basically just saying that the past of science is a graveyard of successful but false theories. And so because in the past, like things like phlogiston theory of combustion, miasma theory of disease, um, like the Aristotelian crystal spheres, Ptolemaic astronomy. I mean, the list goes on and on. The luminiferous ether theory of light. I mean, the list just goes, yeah, like I said, goes on and on. And so
Yeah.
I think his name is Larry Loudon. He actually gives like a list of 15 of them, and he talks about how they were all very successful in their day, but we now regard them as not even approximately true. It's just wholly false. And so he gives this inductive argument.
Realist.
What?
Oh, we kind of cut off there. I was going to say that's kind of one realist argument, though, right? Like they say, um, the truth of a theory can sometimes be determined by its success, but that seems to be demonstrably false, given that there have been theories that have been successful in some applications, but shown to be false. So that's kind of one realist argument, right?
Yeah, definitely. We'll get to that in just a second. That's the central realist argument, Putnam's no miracles argument. But yeah, so that's definitely a fun way to argue in this between the anti-realist and the realist on success and its relation to truth. But so yeah, that's the pessimistic induction. It's very interesting. Another argument that anti-realist we'll come back to like analyzing and evaluating such things like how realists could respond, how anti-realists could respond, etc. Right now, I'm just focusing on getting the general terrain out there, the conceptual terrain. So then another argument that anti-realists appeal to is the argument from Unconceived Alternatives. And this is developed pretty forcefully by, man, his name is evading me right now. Oh yeah, Kyle Stanford. Yeah, he develops this, and it's basically that like it's a sort of combination of underdetermination, which I'll get to in a second, and pessimistic induction. So he basically says that instead of an induction over past false theories, it's an induction over past scientists. So past scientists have failed to conceive of alternative theories to their own theories. And so they mistakenly believed that they had sort of a good grasp of the sort of conceptual sphere with regard to theories that could explain the data and make predictions. So they thought that they had these successful theories, but yet they couldn't conceive of alternative theories that better explain the data, that had better virtues like simplicity, explanatory scope, things like that. And so, and we know this because like quantum, you look at quantum physics, and so many of these concepts required so much conceptual development to even think of them, right? Like wave-particle duality, like someone in the 16th century would have been like, what the hell is wave-particle duality, man? So it was just...
what are particles? Yeah.
It's inconceivable to them. So the induction is basically, we know that past scientists have failed to conceive of relevant alternatives to their theories that better explain or predict the data. And because of that, we can run the induction that, well, present scientists are likely not conceiving of alternatives that better explain or predict the data, and hence we shouldn't accept current mature scientific theories. So that's the argument from Unconceived Alternatives. There's one more argument that's main for anti-realism, and we got about 1 minute before our little break, before our commercial break. So the underdetermination of theory by evidence.
Book, by the way, it's just
what?
It could be a commercial for Joe's book. That's our commercial break.
No. We're down to 30 seconds left. So I'll make the underdetermination point short. Underdetermination is basically the evidence, the empirical evidence in and of itself, anti-realists argue, is sort of insufficient to determine which theory is true among certain competitors that are empirically equivalent. Empirically equivalent just means that they make the same claims about observable reality, but may differ with regard to what they say about unobservable reality. So just the evidence in and of itself does not suffice to determine the truth of one theory over another. And that'll take us into our break. Okay, so we're back after the break. I was talking about underdetermination, yeah, I believe. So, yeah, so just to cap off that point, we can imagine if we have these two axes, right? And we have these two axes, and on them we're plotting these points. And let's say it's just, to make it simple, it looks like it's y equals x. So it's just the identity function. The points are at, like, let's say 1.5, 1.5, etc. So, but it's not a continuous function, because let's say these are observational data. Let's say this is, I don't know, an amount of sunlight and the height of a flower. We could say that, or something along those lines. We're just simplifying things. So we have these points, and it looks like they're forming the identity function y equals x. But the point is, whatever theory we want to draw from this observational experimental data, we can have a different incompatible theory with that theory that is compatible with all the observational empirical data. So we would draw the identity function as our theory, because, that seems to be the simplest explanation. But, we could also have a sort of squiggly line that goes through that, and it's sort of intersecting at all those points, those observational points. So what this shows us is that the evidence by itself, in and of itself, the empirical observational evidence, is not sufficient or adequate to determine which of those lines is true, or which of those lines we ought to accept as a theoretical account of the phenomenon in question. And of course, that gets us into, the realist response is usually to point out there are certain non-empirical virtues, theoretical virtues like explanatory power or explanatory scope, simplicity, coherence with past theories and current theories, and so on and so forth. So, but that's the main point. And then, so that's supposed to block the inference to realism, because we can't believe that our current theories are true or approximately true, because there are so many, perhaps even infinitely many, rivals that equally account for the data, but that are incompatible with ours, because data underdetermines theory. So yeah, that's the underdetermination, and those are the main arguments for anti-realism.
Okay, cool. That's pretty good. Interesting in always. I think you wanted to talk a little bit more about the arguments, I think it was for realism.
Mm-hmm.
So was it the no miracles argument and observation? I think you said you wanted to cover a little bit.
Yeah. So there are a number of arguments for realism. The number one argument, the central argument, is the no miracles argument. It's a little deceptive, because it's not really about miracles per se, as in divine intervention in the natural order, or but it's sort of a misnomer. But it's been kind of relabeled that. It's developed most forcefully by Stathis and other contemporary philosophers, but it was originally developed by Putnam, and he basically said, this is almost a direct quote, the best explanation for the success of science is that realism is the best explanation for the success of science, because it is the only philosophy that doesn't make the success of science a miracle. That is to say, the truth or approximate truth of theories makes sense of why such theories are so successful in terms of their explanations, their predictions, their technological application, and their ability to facilitate manipulation of the natural world, like shooting electrons at things as like an experimental method. So current theories are so successful, and if they weren't true, this would just be like this huge coincidence that they're successful, that we're able to go to the moon and back, but yet the equations that allowed us to go to the moon and back don't describe reality, and the unobservable entities that facilitate such things, or at least we theorize facilitate such things, or underlie such things in a causal manner, don't exist. Like, that just seems so crazy. How could such theories be so successful, so brilliantly successful, if what they say about the unobservable is completely false, not even approximately true? So that's the main argument.
You believe in the moon landing, though?
Okay, let's get into a little bit of history here. Oh man.
Oh, I had to slip that in there just for
It's all
humor.
good. Yeah, it's all good. Whenever you're talking about science, you're gonna have to get into some form of denialism. Uh, eh, it'll crop up anywhere.
We should do a whole episode at some point on young Earth creationism. That'd be a fun one.
Yes, that would be fun. But it's important to note that we're trying to seek the truth together with young Earth creationists. So we need to be open with them and just try to see them as valuable interlocutors and try to engage with them and ascent towards the truth with them. So that's my little spiel. That's my little spiel. Oh yeah, but so the nature of observation. I know you mentioned that, and this is actually a really interesting development. Like that, anti-realism crucially relies on this distinction, this hard and fast distinction between observable and unobservable. But it's not really clear that we can make this hard and fast distinction, right? So one philosopher gives the example of like, it's clearly an observation with me without these glasses that I can see things. Those are observables, like trees and cats and dogs and people. But what about looking through my glasses? Are those things observable? Yeah, quite clearly. Many scientists themselves use glasses in their enterprises. But what about looking through a window pane? Okay, yeah, that's still pretty observable. Those things are observable, yeah. Well, okay, what about what are those things called that you look at ants through? The like detective thing that you look through ants. Look at ants through.
Magnifying glass.
I'm so stupid. I couldn't remember the word magnifying glass. The words magnifying glass. So yeah, well, what about looking through a magnifying glass? Are those observable? Well, it seems so. Those don't seem like quarks and leptons and things like that. Okay, what about a low-powered microscope? Usually we can see a lot of the features of a low-powered microscope with the naked eye, so it seems that the low-powered microscope stuff is going to be unobservable well. So there's this continuum, right? What about a medium-powered microscope? What about a high-powered microscope? Electron microscope? There's no way to draw this line. It's like a Sorites paradox almost, like going from bald to non-bald. Like there's no hard and fast distinction here, and so that's sort of an argument against the anti-realists' distinction there. And moreover, the nature of observation is really fascinating because what scientists and manufacturers do to check their, say, electron microscopes for unobservable things, they build these microscopic chips that you can't see with the naked eye. But these microscopic chips, they're manufactured in such a way that we know that we're designing it with a specific like pattern and structure in mind. And so then we can use the microscope and we can see precisely that structure, how we intended to design it. And so because we intended to design it that way, and it's a microscopic chip that we're looking at on the microscope, and the microscope reveals it to us as how we intended it, the microscope has to be reliable. It has to reveal things that are unobservable to the naked eye. And so it seems that unobservables, we can actually get to them and access them in a reliable truth-tracking manner. And so, of course, one of the difficulties with this is that how do we know that the manufacturing process turned out as we intended it to be? Well, we use microscopes. That's clearly circular, right? Because then we're trying to establish the validity of microscopes, so we can't appeal to microscopes in order to establish validity of the manufacturing process. That's just circular. So that's one difficulty with that. But the realist or the anti-realist would have to maintain that there's this huge cosmic coincidence every time that we make a manufacturing. They have to say not only that we manufacture things incorrectly with regard to how we intended to manufacture them, but also somehow are incorrect, but yet they reveal, being incorrect and unreliable, they reveal the microchips precisely how we intended it to design. So it's like there's like a double miracle here. That's like insane. That it strains credulity, really. So that's how the nature of observation, and specifically the nature of microscopes and manufacturing chips, I think really helps realism. So those are two arguments for realism.
Okay, nice. That's a pretty good case there for either side. Either way anyone tends to be persuaded. I'm kind of agnostic on the issue right now. I tend to lean towards scientific realism, as that seems to be the more plausible view for a naturalist in some ways, or at least the case for naturalism. Graham Oppie sketches, that's the book I've been reading on naturalism and religion, and that's one thing I was going to ask you too, what you thought if the concept of at least not even naturalism metaphysically, but methodological naturalism, kind of what effect that may have on this. Because to me, it seems like a methodological naturalist could really go either way in the realism, anti-realism, but it seems to be would have a little bit more to gain from the realist side. But I'm not sure. I'm again as I'm agnostic on the issue, as I'm not know that much about it yet. But what do you think about how methodological naturalism would affect that debate, or how you view that debate? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I haven't thought much about that. But something you said earlier, I'd briefly like to touch on before getting to this methodological naturalism thing. You said you tend to lean towards scientific realism, and I'd like to point out that it's interesting because we don't necessarily, at least, have to be a scientific realist across the board. So, for example, there are different disciplines within science, although there's a lot of overlap. There's biology, there's chemistry, there's physics, there's astrophysics, etc. And so we can, at least in principle, be scientific realists about biology, be scientific realists about chemistry, but be instrumentalists or anti-realists about physics. And so and there are various ways one could motivate that, like the nature of abstraction that's rife within physics and less within chemistry and biology, etc. Or we can adopt different variants of realism, like structural realism or epistemic realism, structural realism, or the other forms of realism. So yeah, we don't have to be sweeping across the board with one.
Right, because I mean that was going to be. I don't know if you want to do this now or wait till like towards the end, but I think you had like some fluctuation across the board on, I think, what you said you were more towards realism,
we can
chemistry, and biology and such.
We can. I think that's a good point. We can touch on my my leanings towards the end.
Okay.
But so I would like to talk about your methodological naturalism piece and how it relates to this debate. So I think you're right to say that a naturalist doesn't necessarily have to lean one way or the other. Naturalism, of course, in itself, at least in the ontological thesis, is that the only causal things that exist, or the only concrete things, at least, that exist, are natural physical things, natural things, at least. And so, or at least in realities like causally closed, usually they have the closure principle as well. So that in itself is, there's no inherent entailment relation between causal reality being causally closed and only natural things existing, to us having genuine and reliable knowledge of unobservable entities. So there's a sort of disconnect there that I think allows the naturalist to go either way. And as for methodological naturalism, it's a pretty tricky and complex issue, but I think because methodological naturalism is so focused on the importance of science and the scientific method, and that many scientists and their methodology just tend to presuppose realism, I think methodological naturalism coheres at least nicely, perhaps more nicely than it does with anti-realism, with respect to realism. So that is to say, it coheres pretty good with realism, just because it's giving a sort of very robust import and reliability to the scientific method and its principles and techniques and methods with regard to just observing and explaining the structure of reality. So their emphasis on explanation typically leads them towards postulating these unobservable entities, precisely because there are some things in need of explanation that arguably could not be had, or at least not sufficiently had, without these unobservable entities. So I think their focus on not only the reliability and importance and centrality of science, but also the need for explanation in terms of natural explanation. Both of those commitments tend to push them towards realism.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that was my intuition as well, given that, for one reason, that's kind of the case. Graham Hopper's sketches, and I really like a lot of his work, of course. So his two-part definition of naturalism includes methodological. So we talked about that with relay theology and such. So it seems intuitively to be the good view for methodological naturalism. But again, as we said, I don't think that you're necessarily chained down to either one once you go with naturalism ontologically. So
yeah. Unfortunately, we're gonna have to have another commercial break in 20 seconds. So after that, I'll probably be able to discuss some of the motivations one way or the other, and
Yeah, and then finish off hopefully giving you a little bit of a background, got some of what you think, and then. All right, welcome back. Commercial break is over. We're back. I feel like a newscaster. All right, welcome back. So this is kind of
Dear
what we're doing.
gosh.
Yeah, so I think we wanted to go over and have you further elucidate some of the realist responses to anti-realist arguments, or was it the other way around?
Oh no, I think it was the realist responses to the anti-realist arguments.
All right, nailed it. All right.
So there's in responding to the pessimistic induction. Remember that the pessimistic induction just states that because we've had past successful theories that were false, we have inductive basis to think that present scientific theories are false. Well, first of all, it's unclear that this is even good historical scholarship. While the list that Loudon and other anti-realists provide does seem quite biased, like we can get a list of past theories that were not even approximately true, but yet were successful in their day. Sure, we can do that, but merely having a list of many of them doesn't in the slightest entail that most past theories that were successful were also false. And many thinkers have actually compiled lists of theories in the past, and they've done sort of randomization tests on them. And what they found is that actually the amount of retained theories that were successful in the past and that are still retained and accepted today is actually remarkably high, and is much higher than the amount of past theories that were false but successful. So arguably the historical record doesn't really show it, and merely providing the list of the false theories that are successful, that's sort of biasing the sampling process. So that's one response, but that's sort of a historical point, not necessarily a philosophical point. A deeper philosophical point is just that arguably we shouldn't be looking at the history of science in and of itself with sort of equal intervals of time being represented, because we also have to take into account the amount or body of scientific work that's actually occurring at the time, right? Because scientific work, it has been found, actually doubles roughly every 15 to 20 years. So that's measured in terms of the amount of papers published, I believe, in conjunction with the amount of working scientists. And so I forget which philosopher did this analysis, but he found from a study that the amount of scientific work measured in these two ways doubles every 15 to 20 years. And so that means that roughly 50% of all scientific work that's ever been done has been done within the last 15 to 20 years. It's insane. It's insane. And so when you go back, it's like in the 1930s, it's like roughly 80% or along those lines, or 80 to 90% of all scientific work has been done since then. And so we can't be having, let's say, 1600 to 1650 being represented by the same sort of weight, epistemic weight, as the period from 1950 to 2000. Right, because there's the amount of scientific work that's been performed in these same time periods in terms of duration, it's vastly different between the two. And actually, when you give proper weight to the amount of scientific work in the period and the amount of theories that have been rejected, what you find is that the amount of rejection of theories occurs in the infancy of science. There's a lot of change and a lot of there's a lot of theory change in the beginning of science, in the infancy of science, which is precisely what we would expect, and then followed by that, once science sort of gets its grip on things, its methods and principles, etc., there's a long unbroken record of stability when you take into account when you weight the time by the amount of scientists working and the papers published. And so that sort of blocks the neat inductive inference from the history of science to the present, because there's this relevant dissimilarity between the cases, right? Because all the theory changes happen in the infancy of science, whereas for the induction to go through, it would sort of have to be spaced out more regularly. So that's another objection to it. It's also unclear that such past theories were successful in the way that current mature theories are. So a lot of them didn't really make many novel, surprising predictions. Like Einstein's theory of relativity makes some novel predictions with regard to time dilation and light being affected by strong gravitational bodies, gravitational influence. So these are, excuse me, striking and unexpected novel predictions. And novel, what we mean is that such predictions and experimental results were not used in the construction of the theory. And so it's sort of like surprising that it predicts them and then they come true. But this is actually rare, somewhat rare in these theories that he cites, like the humoral theory of disease. Loudon cites. The humoral theory of disease didn't really make many successful novel predictions. It was, in Ptolemaic astronomy, for example, didn't really make many successful predictions. It was sort of built according to the phenomena and sort of constructed around the phenomena. So it's unclear, at least, that such past theories were actually as successful in the relevant way we mean today. So there's also that, which sort of blocks this induction from false but successful past theories to successful theories of today being false as well. So that's against the pessimistic induction. Other realist responses to, let's say, underdetermination is that it's unclear that it can avoid a sort of radical skepticism, right? Because we can think about the traditional Cartesian scenarios, right? Like, Micah, how do you not know that right now you are a brain in a vat? How do you know that that is false? That you are a brain in a vat being fed experiences, or that you're dreaming right now, or that there's this evil demon, malicious demon that's tricking you, deceiving your senses. How do you know that? Well, all the experimental observational data is compatible with that hypothesis, that theory, right? So if we grant that the mere fact that evidence is insufficient to determine which theory is true amongst competing theories, if we grant that, well, then it seems as though we're going to have to grant that in the case of perceptual skepticism, right? Because the realist is trying, the scientific realist is trying to infer from from success to truth, okay? But the underdetermination argument comes along and is like, well, wait a second. Many theories can be successful that are incompatible because their observational consequences are the same, and the observational evidence is insufficient to determine which theory is true. And so then, therefore, we should be agnostic or skeptical on the theory. Yeah, but now we can apply the same thing to the underdetermination of the theory of our perceptual reliability and veridicality. We can apply the same thing to those and the underdetermination of that theory by the evidence. The evidence in and of itself is insufficient to determine between the two theories, right? Everything you experience right now is the exact same under the Cartesian skepticism scenario than it is with the sort of external world realism scenario. And so if underdetermination itself is sufficient to undermine our confidence in the theory, well, then it seems we have to embrace perceptual skepticism, which is absurd. You know, the Moorian shift. I know that I have a hand right now, so skepticism is false. I think it's like a pretty good move, the Moorian shift. Yeah, so that's the main, at least one of the arguments against underdetermination. And then there was one other argument. Oh yeah, unconceived alternatives. Sorry, there's an itch in my throat. I've got water right here. So yeah, unconceived alternatives. The main criticism of that is just that it seems self-defeating, right? Because just as past scientific theorists, past scientists were unable to conceive of good alternatives to their theories, yeah, many philosophers as well. We can run this induction on philosophers as well. Many philosophers of the past were unaware of or could not conceive of. There were unconceived alternatives to their philosophical positions and views and theories that were better than their positions and views and theories that would falsify them. And there are unconceived objections to their theories. For example, Platonism. I know there are a good deal of contemporary Platonists, but Platonism has a lot of objections that, you know, Plato was unable to think of or conceive of at the time. And so we can easily run this induction on past philosophers and their theories as well. So we could argue that, well, okay, premise one, past philosophers were unable to conceive of good objections, decisive objections to their philosophical theories, and alternative theories that are better of reality, or whatever domain of reality they're concerned with, and therefore we have reason to think that present philosophers have excuse me, that present philosophers are not conceiving or thinking of the decisive objections against their arguments and their theories and their views, and in addition, the alternative philosophical theories to present theories. But this would equally apply to what's his name's argument. I'm forgetting his name again. Kyle Stanford. It would equally apply to Kyle Stanford's argument. So there are unconceived objections and criticisms to his argument, and so we shouldn't accept the conclusion of his argument. Okay, well, so much the worse for the argument, because it seems self-defeating. Now, all these raise a host of different questions, so I'm not going to claim that I've defeated anti-realism in one fell swoop. I'm not going to claim that in the slightest bit. But my point is just that there's definitely lively debate in these areas. So those are
for sure.
So yeah.
Well, thanks for the you gave us all a great sketch of that. So that's really good. I'll start reading this book tomorrow. So
yeah, positive science.
Talk more about it, and then I got the Blackwell guide too. I think so.
Nice.
Yeah, so we'll be able to talk more about that. So I think is that most of anything you wanted to say before we go a little bit over, I guess, our positions. I mean, I already gave most of what mine is. Did you have anything else?
Maybe we should cover just a little bit some of the anti-realist potential responses to the realist arguments.
Oh, okay, that's right.
Yeah, so I think we could cover that just a little bit. So with regard to vagueness of observation, while it is true that this is what Bas van Fraassen, the foremost contemporary anti-realist, points out, that while it's true that the concept of observable and unobservable is sort of a vague and continuous spectrum, that doesn't by itself seem too devastating for anti-realism, right? Because merely from the fact that there are vague cases in the middle of the continuum, it doesn't follow that we can't give determinate exact cases on the ends of the continuum. So, for example, let's imagine someone who takes bald people, and they have bald people on one side with no hair, and people like you with your magnificently glorious hair on the other side. And so we have this continuum from bald people to your magnificently glorious hair. And so it would be absurd to say, well, look, there are these cases where it's very vague as to whether someone is bald or whether they have hair, and therefore the very concept of baldness and hairiness and having magnificent hair is just, we should do away with it. No, that's absurd. There are bald people, and that's determinate. There are people with magnificently glorious hair, and that's determinate. That is proved by your very existence. And so what Bas van Fraassen points out is just that he points out, man, I lost my train of thought. What he points out is just the mere fact of vagueness doesn't entail that the distinction is, meaningless or inapplicable, because we do have these determinate cases on the outside. And so he argues that the same can be applied to the observable unobservable distinction. Now, I think that's a good response, but we still have that nature of observation with regard to the microchips and the microscope, right? That, to me, that just strains credulity, and there doesn't seem to be a plausible response to that. Sorry, my throat is killing me.
You okay over there? Yeah.
I'm dying. Well, we've got about a minute and 30 seconds left, so the no miracles argument, it's basically an inference to the best explanation, and there are a number of criticisms of this. First of all, some allege that inference to the best explanation is question-begging. I am dying!
Joe's just gonna start coughing up blood out of nowhere on in the middle of the...
I did get my wisdom tooth surgery the other day, so...
That's true, that's right. So that's probably not helping anything.
So yeah, that's definitely, it's this post-surgical disease. They call it wisdom teeth-induced itchy throat. It's a scientific term.
I think I've heard of that one, yeah.
Okay, got less than a minute left. We got the no miracles argument. We still got the base rate fallacy to cover from, and we still got the circularity objection. So I'll briefly go over the circularity objection. Speed time. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, put your things on double speed because we're going fast. Gear up and get your seatbelt on. Okay, so
You're blowing all your time on preparing.
Yeah. Oh man, as many people will be as our millions of listeners will definitely be listening to this as they commute to work. Now we're down to 20 seconds. Great. So the circularity objection is basically the anti-realists wouldn't even grant the thought that inference is the best explanation is a plausible inference, because it's precisely inference is the best explanation infers the truth of an explanation from the fact that it's the best explanation, but that's precisely what realists would deny is legitimate. So,
Welcome back to, I don't know, we don't have a title for this, but yeah, commercial break number 3 is over, and yeah, here's Joe's warming up, I guess. So you wanted to talk, just getting pumped, like, all right. So I think you wanted to talk a little bit about some more objections to the no miracles argument.
yeah. So there were two that I mentioned there at the end. One of them is just the question-begging nature of the inference to the best explanation, and the second one is the base rate fallacy. So the first one I touched on it at the end, but it's hard for me to understand it, even because I think inference to the best explanation is so self-evidently a good rule of inference and reliable, but people would disagree with me on that, and the idea is that the inference from something's being a good explanation to its being true, or to its having like good explanatory virtues and its best explaining some phenomena to its being true, is precisely an inference that anti-realists would never make, precisely because they either reject this need for to explain things further in terms of truth, or because they they mainly reject the inference from explanation to truth. They would just hold for like things being empirically adequate and not having to have an inference to the best explanation, even if there's a best explanation in terms of truth, or at least approximate truth. So there's that. I mean, I'm gonna be honest. This is a very biased presentation of this particular objection, because I find this so implausible. I think that would entail a sort of global skepticism with regard to our abductive inferences. Abductive is just inference to the best explanation. So, like, we use it in everyday life. Like, when your car doesn't start, we start thinking about, well, what are the plausible explanations? I heard this specific noise, and so it couldn't be so-and-so because that wouldn't have made a noise. So what best explains this noise? Or, like, Bass van Frassen gives the example, like, if you hear the pitter-patter of little feet at night and your cheese is gone, the best explanation for that is that there's a mouse in your house. And it's not just that the hypothesis that there's a mouse in your house is empirically adequate or anything. It's that it's true, and it best explains the phenomena, and it's true. Its truth best explains the phenomena, and so we accept that it's true. We accept that there's a mouse in the house. So yeah, there's that objection. There's also the base rate fallacy. We know that success in and of itself does not entail, strictly speaking, truth. Because we have models, for example, that contain idealizations, simplifications, abstractions, but yet are incredibly successful in their predictions, right? We have, so we intentionally misrepresent phenomena, like making something to be a point mass, whereas it's this huge gravitational body. It's not a point mass. We intentionally misrepresent something as not being affected by air resistance. We intentionally assume that a population is infinite in population genetics. We intentionally assume, for the sake of simplicity and predictive power, that models of the ocean, we can assume that it's infinitely deep, or that the behavior of the particles is sort of like a continuous medium, or that it's discrete particles. So we can represent these different ways and intentionally build in falsehoods or abstractions or idealizations. Even, like an ideal gas. That's like a definition. Those are just tiny points. The gas molecules, they're represented as just tiny points that bash together with perfectly elastic collisions, which means that the kinetic energy beforehand is totally transferred to the kinetic energy of the other particle after. There's no heat loss, there's no sound loss. Yeah, so all the energy is transferred there in that collision. So we know we have these built-in falsehoods, and they seem to be essential for success, for the success of these models and even these theories. So the mere fact that a model is incredibly successful in terms of its predictions and its explanations, that doesn't by itself entail truth, because we know that there are falsehoods in there, and they can be even essential for the predictive power, the scope, the simplicity, etc. So because it doesn't entail it, we have to actually give a sort of probabilistic account, right? But once we give a probabilistic account saying that, well, success raises the probability of truth, Well, now in order to actually make that inference, we have to know the base rate of true theories within the population of true successful theories within the population of successful theories. And that's precisely what we don't have access to. And so it commits what probability theorists call the base rate fallacy, and this is expounded nicely by Magnus and Callender, those two philosophers. So of course there are some responses to that. Some say that it's not really committing the base rate fallacy because it's a realism is an explanation about the base rate itself, namely that the base rate must be high for true theories within the class of successful theories, etc., etc. It raises a lot of complicated issues in Bayesianism and probability theory and so on. So yeah, the jury's out on that one, I think. But yeah, I'll turn it over to you for just a second.
Okay, great. So is that everything you wanted to cover in terms of?
I think so. I think it covers most of the stuff about realism and anti-realism that, this is just a basic introductory mainly, so you can get much deeper. But I think, what did you want to discuss? Our personal views? Do you want to elaborate on that a bit further?
Sure, we can do that. Thank you again for the description and everything, and
no problem.
definition. I'll definitely go back and re-listen to this one after it's up a couple times and pick it apart and then read. So, as I said, we can talk about that more. But yeah, personal views, as I said, mine are not going to be very refined at this point because I haven't looked into science specifically. I'd say, as I said, just intrinsically, like initially, what seems to be more plausible, given my leanings towards metaphysical or ontological naturalism, I think methodological follows at least somewhat accurately from that. I mean, I feel like we can be justified in methodological naturalism while holding ontological. So it's hard to say what I lean towards, though, given that I would like to lean towards like pure realism in, say, biology, but given some questions, same with chemistry, like given some questions you and I have discussed a little bit concerning like abiogenesis and the gaps with that, and the question really of reductionism in science, which is not necessarily part of like the realism-anti-realism issue, but I think there's at least some cause for like maybe caution in terms of total confidence in that. So I'd say like maybe something like moderate realism almost in regards to into those positions. But I like what Graham Oppy says a lot about science in terms of like we seem to have somewhat justified reason to think that the science we have now is at least predictive of ideal science or like science we're going to have in the future. So I'd say like almost like a hopeful realism would be what I'd say with just a tinge of enough skepticism to maybe. So I mean maybe lean towards something like deconstructivist empiricism in like advanced astrophysics or something, given that I don't understand those all that well.
Yeah.
Because I mean, there's still stuff scientists don't know about, like why gravitational poles don't seem to be as effective at the micro and macro levels. So there's still a lot that seems to operate on at least a little bit of mystery that it hinges on. So I don't know. I'd kind of lean towards like I like the methodological naturalist principles, and so that pushes me a lot towards scientific realism, at least in practice, or at least leaning towards that. But I'd say with just a little bit of enough caution to understand the fact that our inferences and empirical observation have been, and it's very possible they still will be, incorrect about something. But I'd say we should at least hope and have somewhat warranted reason to believe that our science now is at least somewhat predictive of what we're going to have in the future as an ideal science, although maybe not perfectly. So I don't know exactly what I don't know if my view fits in any actual definition, but that's just my initial thoughts.
That's really interesting. I like that. Yeah. So it sounds like you lean broadly realist. Yeah.
Broadly, sure. Yeah. It's fair.
That's not like some technical term. I just wanted to say broadly realist, like a broadly Aristotelian metaphysics, things like that. It's just broadly is a fun word. Sounds like Broadway. There's some sort of connection there. I'm guessing. I'm not guessing that. That was a joke. You're supposed to laugh. The pity laugh. So yeah, my views. Of course, I have to recognize that I'm incredibly limited in this regard. Like, I haven't done a ton of research into every crevice of this debate. Like, I have to recognize my epistemic limitations here. That my conclusions are very provisional. My epistemic status is by no means certain in any of these regards. And I recognize that there are people who are experts and who have studied this more than me and who disagree with me. And so, I really have to recognize the limits of the justification of my position that I'm about to expound. So, with those necessary prerequisites out of the way, the preconditions for intelligibility, shout out to all our presuppositionalists out there. So with those prerequisites out of the way, I lean towards a scientific realism in biology. I lean towards a scientific realism in chemistry, and in a lot of physics, I lean towards scientific realism, but also for a significant portion of physics, I lean towards what's called structural realism. So structural realism is basically the thesis that we should be realists about the sort of abstract mathematical structure, or the structural and causal relations between things of a given domain, whereas we should remain agnostic or skeptical about what the theory says about the intrinsic nature of the things that stand in those abstract relations. And so I would sort of motivate this with regard specifically to physics, by pointing to the nature of the highly abstract nature of physics. So the mathematics in physics, I think, is incredibly predictably successful. I mean, it's just brilliant. It allows us to do space travel, and it's just wonderful. And so in that regard, I would definitely take a realist route. But whether or not we can sort of define realism in different ways, like entity realism or structural realism, and so I think I would lean towards a structural realism because such mathematical relationships, they're abstracted so deeply from these from whatever stand in these relations, right? Like, and this also so yeah, it's basically the nature of abstraction, abstracting away the individuating features of the basic fundamental physical particles, whatever their nature be, and we're mainly capturing their causal and mathematical and abstract relations to one another. And physics, I think we have reason to be agnostic on what physics says about their intrinsic nature. So yeah, that's mainly what I would say about those. And of course, this is also motivated a little bit by sort of metaphysical considerations. Like, I think, like, what even is an electron? What is the physical significance of an electron? Like, we tend to conceptualize them as tiny little billiard balls that bash into one another, but we know that that's just untrue. Like, they have wave particle properties, it seems. They behave very differently. We're told that they're just clouds of probability. Yes, but what is the very meaning of a cloud of probability? In fact, the cloud itself, that's sort of just an abstraction from our everyday experience of clouds in the sky. Like, there aren't literal clouds down there. And what even is a probability manifested in the physical sense? I think these are very, very deep issues, and I don't claim to have all the answers, of course. But I think they help us see that whatever this fundamental stuff physics studies, the intrinsic nature seems somewhat beyond our grasp and somewhat beyond the scope of science. And so science captures the structure, but not sort of the intrinsic nature of those entities. And I think we need to bring in metaphysics, a suitable metaphysics of material objects for that. But these are all questions. This raises so many questions, of course, and
oh yeah.
yeah. So yeah, we've got only about 45 seconds left.
Oh wow, we went all the way.
I know.
Okay.
We got to soak it in.
What do we want to finish off with?
I don't know, my dude.
Well, I guess if it's gonna be the end of the whole video.
Well, I've got a plug.
Okay.
I got a plug. Josh Rasmussen's got a really good book coming out.
That's the whole book.
I know.